So what I've done so far is I wrote the beginning stage of what could be the opening scene for my future storyline, and now what I want to do is use some theory and techniques to try to craft it into an actual opening scene that is engaging and interesting and also thematically fits in with the rest of the story. The first thing that I want to look at are different opening types, and then I want to go through two techniques: creating an opening scene and how to find the best first line for your story. Scene construction process from Anatomy of Story. So this is basically a process that you can use for all kinds of scenes, and here I'm just applying it to the opening scene. There's some specific stuff about opening scenes in theory also in this book, but it doesn't really matter here because what I'm interested in is mostly just the steps to go through to actually create a scene. So as you can see here, it's a 9-step process, and there's also something mentioned about starting the scene as late as possible. So basically what I talked about when it came to throwing the reader into action is exactly what his key tip here is. It's basically just have the scene already, basically start ongoing, have something happen, and don't try to slowly lead the reader towards starting the scene because that's just boring. So the first step is to figure out where on the character arc the protagonist is and how they basically start off the scene. So in my case, Alex is basically at this point where he's been in his job for 2 months and he's been trying to make it seem like he's good at his job, he's trying really hard. And this is now the starting point where he gets a case, a problem that is too much for him to handle. What he doesn't know and what the other detectives and so on don't know yet is obviously that this isn't just too much for him to handle, it's actually a case that none of them can solve with the normal means, right? So this is basically, he's been trying so hard to be good enough at this job that he never had the talent for, never had the real motivation for, and now he's been given this kind of situation where it's impossible to succeed, and this case really makes it impossible for him to succeed. So trying harder and harder is not going to work. And that's basically where we start off. He's been sort of in this denial, and now this situation is going to make it impossible for him to continue in that. Then the next step is, what is the problem that is being solved in this scene? So basically the idea is that there's something happening in this scene, right? There's like a key action, and that's what this problem here represents. So what exactly happens in the scene? So if the overall story is about basically going from this mystery to knowing that they are being invaded, what exactly happens just in the opening scene? And that's where the thing that I talked about before, that there's more theory here in Anatomy of Story. There's this thing that he talks about having like triangle within a triangle. The opening scene represents the overall story in mini form. So it's a mini story that basically tells us what the entire story is going to be. I like that as a starting point. So if it's about figuring out the mystery of it's not some case, it's about being invaded, then what happens within this one opening scene that is basically a mini version of that. So maybe not just the opening chapter, but actually the entire future storyline, where it could be we are being invaded, and because we are being pushed so far, we're going to fight back in equally destructive ways. So that could be what happens in the opening scene as well. So something that could happen within the scene is that basically Alex ends up volunteering for taking the case. So how about this? There are several investigators arriving at this scene, and Alex is a bit in competition with another junior investigator and has been trying very hard to prove himself and so on, and because of that ends up volunteering in some way for this case, which then obviously will come back to really harm him. I think I like that because it gives him more agency. He kind of caused his problem to a degree himself, but also it basically contrasts with, because later on when he starts to figure out that he can't solve the case, he's more interested in getting rid of the case and having someone else take it on than he is in actually helping the relatives, which then becomes another character change later on when he has lost everything, and that becomes important, right? So that could be a good mini version of basically the overall thing, right? It's kind of like this competition thing comes into play, which will be a factor for the overall story as well. And here it's this mini version of that. Because in this opening scene there are two problems at play in that case. So we have this plot problem of basically arriving at the scene, taking in the account of what happened and having no idea where all these people have gone, right? So it's not solved in any way. This is really just taking in the information and starting the mystery. And then we have on the character level where basically his problem is that he needs to prove himself, and he does that here by ending up volunteering. So that could also be in contrast with what I talked about before of having show how Alex is very good at his job within that opening scene and still volunteering to take on this case. So because the opening scene isn't solving the problem of what happened, right? This is really just they are taking in the information and starting a case from it to find out what happened. That's the overall problem to solve. And in this opening scene, the problem is who is going to take the case. That would be the problem. Then the third step is the strategy of solving the problem. So basically it's this idea of you have given this problem for this scene, right, to unfold, and then you take the viewpoint of probably the protagonist who has to figure out what to do and how to react to it or act in this scene and basically solve that problem and how to do it. So in my case, if I go from the viewpoint of Alex, then it's basically he starts out the scene with the problem of feeling like he's not good enough, like he needs to prove himself, and this is a opportunity to do that. And the strategy to prove himself would be to take this case and feel kind of like if he can solve it, he can prove himself and so on. So that's an easy version of going with that. Then step number 4 is the desire, and basically whose desire drives the scene. So what do they want? And here it's either the desire of the protagonist drives the scene, so they're the active one who are pushing something, or they are reacting to some other character whose desire is leading the scene. So breaking it down, who is in this scene and who has different desires. So we have Alex, whose desire is to prove himself. We have the relatives, the witnesses who are still at the scene who want to find out what happened to all the people who went missing. We have probably some senior police investigator, someone who just wants to have someone take on the case, preferably not themselves. So probably this senior person has enough experience to know that this case is going to be really difficult, really problematic, and potentially career damaging. So someone who would look out for someone who could take on the case. Then we have maybe this other junior investigator who doesn't feel the same pressure as Alex does and who doesn't feel the same kind of competition, and because of that wouldn't be so eager to take on the case and might actually be more eager to, be invisible and not end up taking on the case. So in this case, the person whose desire is leading the scene is really the most senior investigator at the scene, who can decide who has to take on this case and who basically has to decide how this case is taken on, right? That the relatives don't really have a choice in how this is being done. So this person's desire, the senior someone. So then the 5th step is the endpoint, and that's basically where does the scene end. And here in this theory, it's all about having the scene lead to one basic point, one key element. So this would be like the final word or the final sentence or this final reveal of the scene. And that kicks off the next scene, which in this case could mean that you have all the investigators at the scene and they're taking in the information and basically figuring out what is going on. And all of this leads to this final element of Alex being the one put in charge of this case, which ties back into the character arc thing that we talked about, of this being the problem that starts off for him, right? Before that, it was really just, there's a problem, obviously, but it's like a case, it's like clinical work, it's not really personal yet, and now that it's his case and he's so tied to it, it will become personal. Number 6 is the opponent in the scene and what are the characters fighting over. So here this could be the senior investigator who wants to pawn off the case onto one of the juniors, and then you have the 2 juniors, Alex and the other one, who are sort of silently fighting over not necessarily wanting to take on the case, and Alex then losing out because he feels this pressure pressure of proving himself, and maybe there are like subtle words or phrases or something used against him that forces him to basically then end up taking on the case. So it's not completely voluntary, because otherwise there wouldn't be any conflict. More like he steered himself into a situation where he then ended up having to take on the case. Number 7 is the plan, and what exactly happens in the scene based on one of the characters' desire, which we had earlier, and also who's the main opponent, right? So here the desire was this senior investigator whose desire it is to pawn off this case to one of the juniors. So this person is driving the action in the scene, and to do that they have a plan. And here you have two options. You have either the direct plan or the indirect plan, where the direct plan is really just the character wants one thing and the character is going directly for it, making it very clear that that is what they want. And you have the indirect plan, which is they pretend to want something else, but it is actually this one thing that they want and they're trying to push that, but not making it obvious. And then obviously the other characters in the scene would react to those plans and maybe have their own plans in order to try to counteract. So in this case it would be probably an indirect plan. It's not that the senior investigator goes and just assigns the case to one of the juniors. So it could be a situation where it would be normal for a senior investigator to actually take on the case themselves, but not unheard of them to assign it to a junior one if the junior is ready to do so, right? So in that case, it has to be an indirect plan. It can't just be an order. And then it would be very much framed in a way of trying to get to the weak points of those two juniors trying to prove themselves and being fairly new in the department. And so then the response from Alex could be either that he doesn't pick up on this being this indirect plan being completely played and ending up to volunteer, or it could be that he picks up on it and he's trying to openly state as much, but that wouldn't be successful in this situation because there's this power dynamic between senior and junior, right? So here I think I'm going for the first option, where it's basically the senior implies indirectly that one of the junior has to take it on, and when both of them are reluctant, starts to push more into Alex's weak spot of having to prove himself, of the family connection in the department, and this being then how Alex falls for this plan basically and has no other choice of taking it on, both from external circumstances but also mostly internal, this pressure of having to do right. And so a difference also between the direct plan and the indirect plan is that a direct plan would more often lead to direct conflict immediately in the scene, whereas an indirect plan might make the characters look like they agree, but then later on there's more conflict there because of it. So in this case, for example, when Alex agrees, it obviously looks like all the characters are in harmony and agreement, and then later on this conflict will come up again. Then the 8th step is conflict, and either the conflict leads to a solution or the conflict leads to a breaking point. So basically when the scene ends, you either have a new solution or you have new conflict that kicks off the new scene. So in my case, because Alex ends up taking on the case, it seems like a new solution, right? This original problem of who takes on the case is solved, and then that kicks off the next scene and Alex's new problem. And then the 9th step sounds a bit optional, so that's where occasionally you have a twist or a reveal where basically one character tells another off and reveals something about themselves, or a twist event happens, stuff like that. So that's not necessarily in there always. It depends on your story and if it fits. For me right now, I think I want to leave this step out because right now I have enough stuff going on to not try to add any twists right now. I first want to write the scene and then we'll come back to it if necessary. But this is basically how this technique goes. Just looking at it, I really like how you're guided through this technique, and also I like how it brought me to more conflict between the characters, more interesting starting points for the scene and what could happen within the scene just through working through these steps. Obviously, I am now at a point where I already had a lot of material to work with as input to apply this technique on, right? So that's what I would recommend if you want to try out this technique yourself, is that you already have fairly much material to shape with this technique, and don't use this technique as a complete starting point when you don't have any idea what could happen in the scene. Okay, and so this is what this could look like. So now I used the opening stuff that I had and added added in those elements that we just figured out. And basically what you can see here is it's still starting with dialogue, then it's basically Alex at the scene having the interview with the host. I need to figure out names and stuff, but for now having the interview with the host and then being mid-interview interrupted by a senior who then basically coerces Alex alongside with the other junior into taking on the case. And this is where the end point is, basically having here Alex realize that he's been put in charge of this case by himself. And also an element of the family conflict to come would be this line of having this uncle being mentioned, of being somewhat related to Alex's career and also working in the department.